Hello, you're listening to A Conversation With, the podcast where each week I'm joined by a different guest and we talk about a topic of their choice. My name is Jason and this week we have a new guest for you, so why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, my name is James and I live in the south of England and I work from home.
Okay, so what is the topic you've picked for us today?
Working as a translator.
Wow, so I suppose the obvious question we're going to ask is, translating what?
I guess the first thing is there's a distinction to be made, because sometimes when I say to people I'm a translator, they think that maybe I stand somewhere and I translate while somebody else is speaking, maybe in a court or at a doctor's or something like that. But that's a different job.
Okay, so that's not what you... First of all, could we just get... What language then are you translating?
I translate from Norwegian into English.
Okay, so
mainly.
If we're listening to this podcast, probably we're learning English or we speak English very well, so we know what English sounds like. Could you just give us a little taste of Norwegian?
Okay, I wasn't expecting this, but norsk is Norwegian. Norsk et språk som en germanisk språk. Norwegian is a language. This is a Germanic language.
Okay, so
det er ganske slikt med engelsk. It's quite related to English, but obviously it's been separated by 1,500 years or something.
Yeah, so you're telling me it's quite related. I'm not hearing it, but
No,
maybe someone at home is going, yeah, I see what he means.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So you're translating, would you say it's predominantly Norwegian into English or English into Norwegian?
Yeah, in general, I translate into English. Most professional translators will translate into their mother tongue. I'm English by birth and I was brought up speaking English. So in my work, I translate from other languages, mainly Norwegian, into English.
Into English, excellent. So you said that you're not that guy standing in the corner, maybe with the little headset on, who's translating kind of on the fly.
Yeah.
So what kind of translations are you doing?
Right. So that kind of thing we would normally refer to as interpreting in the business. I'm a translator. I'm a technical translator. So what that means is I sit with my computer and I translate documents from one language into another. That could be almost anything.
A few examples for us?
Well, we have a wide range of clients. So, for instance, because I'm translating from Norwegian, immediately you think, okay, what kind of industries are there in Norway? Well, there's the oil and gas industry. So I've done quite a lot for that. Sometimes it's really technical. Sometimes it's kind of marketing stuff. Also, they do fish farming in Norway. That's a big business now. So I do translations about fish farming.
So I suppose you're going to need quite a varied vocabulary to handle these very different topics.
This is true. Fortunately, these days, with this remarkable thing called the internet, it's increasingly possible to find references so you can learn about what you're translating. If you've never dealt with fish farming before, I mean, I certainly hadn't, but you can go online and you can read in English about fish farming and all the technology that's used and the techniques, and then you can go online and read in Norwegian about fish farming, and then you can put the two together. If you understand the Norwegian, basically you'll then understand all the words except the few technical ones, and you can start learning. So as a translator, that's an example, as a translator you end up having a very shallow, broad knowledge. Generally, you tend to know a little bit about an awful lot of different things. So my background is in programming. I was a computer programmer, so IT is a field I know fairly well. So often I do translate IT related texts. It could be software manuals, or it could be some companies trying to work out something to do with their computer security or anything. So sometimes it's going to be that. Sometimes it's tourism. Obviously Norway, people like to go there on a holiday because it's an attractive place, and so there will always be hotels and other tourist places that want stuff translated into English.
Is there anything you kind of favour, you prefer translating?
Actually, IT stuff is good. I like that because it's somewhere I'm comfortable with that. Scientific stuff I like because it's interesting for me. I've again got a bit of a scientific background, so I was doing some stuff recently to do with ecological recycling and the chemical processes involved, and I found it interesting just to read about it, and it was interesting the kinds of things that it was explaining. So it was a fascinating project. Some things are not so fascinating.
Yeah. Any examples?
A dry legal contract.
Right, I imagine that's a commonplace thing that you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah.
What would you say are some of the challenges that come with being a translator?
You have to be pretty focused. Some people can work with music on in the background and stuff. I have to have total silence, I'm afraid, because if I can hear any other speech, it just interferes with my brain processing these two languages at once. You've got to be focused because translation's normally to a reasonably tight deadline. So you can't procrastinate. You can't think, I'll leave that till tomorrow, because then you'll put yourself under too much pressure the following day and you'll end up rushing the job. So that's a bit of a challenge. It's not one of these things that you just get done what you get done each day, because you know that by the end of that day you've got to be in a certain place or have delivered that translation. So especially because I work from home, I don't have anyone breathing down my neck. You've got to be fairly focused in what you're doing, and yeah.
So I'd imagine you've seen other people's translations.
That does come up.
Yeah.
Part of my job is to check other people's translations. Yeah.
And any interesting translations you've come across?
Yeah, obviously I wouldn't be specific here, and no doubt the people who check my work, they do find mistakes as well, because we are not, no translator is perfect. But there are pitfalls to watch out for in translation.
Could you give us maybe some examples? Because I think many of us we've probably found, if speaking a second language, that we come across certain, I would say, common universal problems. Yeah. So I'm wondering if they're going to be the same with translation, or if maybe there's a different problem that crops up.
I think the problems that people generally come up against in translation is where they see, obviously, it's been translated by someone who does not speak, whose native language is not the language they're translating into. So you read an instruction manual, maybe it's just a short sheet of instructions, and you think, I can't work out what's going on here. And that's either going to be because the person who's translated it doesn't really understand or can't write clear English, or maybe they didn't understand the original document clearly. So those are the things. People laugh about bad translations, and those are the normal things. But good translators will make, as I say, there are pitfalls. Some people will fall into the trap of what I call translating between the punctuation.
Right.
So you've got your full stops and your commas and so on. Okay, you translate a sentence at a time. But from my point, it might read better if I convert those two sentences into one, or break that one sentence into two. And equally, just because there's a comma there in the Norwegian or the Swedish or whatever I'm working with, that doesn't mean there should be a comma there in English, because different languages have different punctuation rules. Danish, for instance, peppers, it's writing with commas with very strict rules. English doesn't work to those rules. So you can't, it's something I've seen, translating between the punctuation, but you need to take maybe a paragraph as a whole and think about how that works best.
Yeah, so I suppose this goes back to where you were talking of really understanding the material, being able to read about it. And I suppose it shows one of the difficulties or challenges with your job, because I suppose with speaking a language, well, one, nobody can see your bad spelling because you're just speaking the words, and generally people can't hear your punctuation always, so you can get away with it a little bit more than when it's written down, and if it is a legal document or something like that. One thing that did interest me, I know you'd mentioned to me beforehand, was that you've done some translations like subtitles for TV shows or for documentaries, things like that. I imagine that must be quite challenging, because you've also got to kind of match it up in time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very technical aspect of it, and fortunately there are specialists in that field who I work along with. Normally when I've done subtitling, and it happens probably at least once a month I'll do some. Normally they will send me it as a text file and just ask me to translate it. They've already broken it down into the chunks that will go on each screenful. But in that situation, they have maybe taken three seconds worth of speech, and they might have already truncated it to fit the space available. But I might want to, if I'm translating it into English, to make it read well and sound like somebody speaking, I then have to shuffle it around, because you've only got a certain amount of space on each line. It's normally, I think, 48 characters, and you've got 2 lines. So in subtitling, often the thing is, okay, what can we leave out and still keep the message so that nothing important is lost? So that's a particular challenge there.
Yeah. So I think it's really highlighted probably a number of things I know that I wasn't aware of, and I'm sure, sorry guys, I'm going to speak on your behalf. I'm imagining maybe the majority of listeners wouldn't have been aware of some of these challenges. I think we just, think kind of Google Translate, you drop the text in, it gives you word for word what's different, and sometimes you think, well, maybe that word should swap around. But from what you're telling us, it seems like there's a lot more thought that needs to go in to this. So how much are you expected to, I mean, considering there's all of this going into it, how much are you expected to translate in a day?
That's an interesting point. Yeah, obviously a lot of thought does have to go into it. From my limited experience of the translation industry, and each language is different, but generally what is expected in the field I work in is that you would translate maybe 2,000 words in a typical working day. Now that's an average, because sometimes you will come up with really technical engineering documents that take a lot of research. That will mean that you are not going to get 2,000 words of that translated in one day. Equally, if I get something that's IT related, maybe a client that I've worked with many times before, and I know how they work and their terminology, I might be able to get through those 2,000 words in half my day, if it's really straightforward. If you get sent something that has been badly written, and that leaves you with lots of questions you have to get clarified, maybe there's lots of technical terms that you're not sure how to translate, that then takes a long time. The killer is menus, restaurant menus. They're interesting to do, but a 200-word menu could take you half a day, because you've got all of the culinary terms. Even if you're the kind of person who likes watching MasterChef and cooking shows and likes going to restaurants, and you think you know the stuff, there will be things appearing on a menu for a restaurant in Norway, for instance, that you've not come across before. It's always different types of fish. And that's a challenge. There's always lots of research to do when you're doing a menu. And then you've got to make it sound menu-y.
Sound menu-y. That's an important word. Write that one down. Menu-y. So is there anything... So menus we've understood are surprisingly difficult. I think that's probably, again, one of the things that you'd assume is quite easy, because, it's food. I'll just grab a dictionary and I'll look up what that food is, and I'll just write the ingredients next to each other. But we, once again, looking, peek behind the curtain, we see that a lot more goes into it. So is there anything that when it arrives, in the inbox, you're like, oh, I've got to do one of these, you just think, brilliant, this is the easiest job I can get. So is there something you really like translating because it is almost that simple? I don't want to say copy and paste, but you know what I mean. It's a very easy job to do. What's the kind of the easiest thing you deal with?
I guess I would come back to IT stuff. Things to do with explaining to users how to do something in some software. I've been there. I was a programmer. I've written software manuals. And especially if the document that I've been sent has got lots of screenshots in it, which it probably has because I've been sent, the Norwegian manual to translate, I can see what's going on. In some cases, I'm given a copy of the software or given access to this website, so I can see what they're explaining. Yeah, then normally that's the kind of thing that it's not too difficult for me to get my head around. That's just because of my background. Some things are more straightforward.
Is there anything that, the the general user or the general listener now to the podcast, we might have come across that perhaps it would surprise us to know, well, actually that was maybe translated from Norwegian. I'm trying to think if there's any product I have or anything I use that possibly I didn't realize some poor guy had to sit behind a computer for a few days to translate this for me. I'm thinking not, because I'm pretty sure I'm not involved in any fish farming. I'm not 100% sure. It might be, but you've talked about a lot of software, computer stuff. But is that generally kind of very niche, specific software, or is there some more general stuff?
It does tend to be niche software. The stuff I've dealt with anyway. But anything produced by, I've been talking about Norwegian because that's my field, but we'll stick to that. But anything that could be produced by a company in that country that they want to sell in the wider world, certainly the English-speaking world, they are going to want to have that translated into English. The big Norwegian companies do their annual reports, and they always do them in Norwegian and English. So somebody has to sit down and laboriously translate very long financial reports. Because someone's interested in it, even if we aren't.
Yeah, it's not me, I'll let you know.
No.
So, we're thinking of who's interested in it. I'd like your opinion then on this, because once again, I'm speaking on your behalf, dear listeners, but if you're like me, you go out, you buy a product, probably let's be honest, it wasn't made in England, so it's been made somewhere else. I get it home, I open it up, I've got the box, I've got the manual, and I've got the device. So what do? I take the device, I throw the box and the manual not in the bin, I've got to keep it, so it goes in that cupboard with all the other boxes, and I don't even glance at that manual. Now, how does that make you feel when you're on the other side of it, and you were probably one of those people that said, well, hold on, I spent hours translating that manual for you. Does it make you maybe read them when you buy something new?
You know what I always have? It's actually partly because they're in multiple languages. I've always been a bit of a language nut. So for as long as I can remember, even when I was a kid, if something was in multiple languages, I'd be comparing them to try and see what was related and what I could recognise and so on. So I guess I've always been doing that. So you look at the back of a chocolate bar, and this one's got the ingredients list in Swedish and Finnish. Oh, cool, Estonian. And I'd start, imagine me age 14 doing that kind of thing. Well, yeah, I guess I still do. And when you see something that's, okay, admittedly, I don't go through guarantees. 20 pages in 20 languages is not my thing.
Do you click accept and I've read them?
Yeah,
yeah.
We've
got that on record now.
Yeah, I page down quick. I skim read. Yeah. Let's be honest.
So after what you've just told us, I've now got a question I'm burning to ask. Ever translated a chocolate bar?
Yes.
What was it?
Actually, quite early on in my career, if I can laughingly call it that, I was asked to translate the ingredients lists and other product declarations on a number of different types of sweets and chocolate assortments from Norway. And I remember we had quite an extended discussion because I worked with translators translating into the other languages. We had quite an extended discussion about how to translate this particular expression in Norwegian, and it was to do with the fact that the product contained artificial sweeteners, and that having too many of these sweets could have a certain effect on one's body.
All right, okay.
And so I went to the supermarket and I did some research, and then I was able to tell the client that the usual wording on this wasn't what they wanted it to say, but the usual wording was excessive consumption may produce laxative effects. And they had to go with that because I produced photographic proof that that's what everyone else was saying in English.
Well, I'm sure for many you're an unsung hero because anyone that's perhaps got a problem and we're chowing down on this a little bit too much, they probably appreciate the warning. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's been quite interesting thinking back of some of the conversations we've had up until this point. This is probably the most informative and well-researched topic we've discussed, but once again, as always, reaching out to any listeners. If you've got a topic at the end, we'll plug the ways you can send that in. But it is nice to have this overview of this kind of job. Again, possibly thinking about some of our audience being language learners, it might be that this is a career path they're looking into. If that is the case, is there any sort of suggestions? We like to ask at times for recommendations or suggestions. Anything you could suggest to somebody who's maybe got their eye on a job in either interpreting or translating or doing this kind of work?
Yeah, obviously, really, really understanding the source language, the foreign language, to the extent that you possibly can, that's going to be vital. For many people, that's going to mean going and living in that country for a while. But never lose touch with your mother tongue, because especially if you're a technical translator or you're translating documents, the one thing that you will really be marked on, if you like, is the quality of your writing in your mother tongue. Because you might really understand the other language, you might be able to speak it fluently, but if you can't write clearly in your own tongue, and if you don't know how to punctuate things properly, and if you can't construct something so that what you produce is better than the source document, your fellow translators, who after all it's their job to check what you do, they will say, this guy or this girl, they need to pay more attention to detail. But if you can produce something that feels like it wasn't translated, your real aim is to produce something that looks as if it was written by someone who was English in the first place, or if that's the language you're translating into. So it doesn't read as if it was translated. That's your aim. So
it's interesting, because I think if it was me, or once again speaking on behalf of others, probably we'd think, well, what I need to do is really master this foreign language. I've got to make sure I know that so well. But you're saying, well, actually, yes, you need to know that language, but make sure you know your language even better. So that's an interesting point. So the probably only common thing that happens every episode of this podcast is when I hand over to you, I've been asking all the questions. So at this point, we like to flip it on its head. You get to ask me some questions about your chosen topic, which is translation, I suppose we'll say is the overview title here. So did you have anything you wanted to ask me about translation?
Well, now let's see. Jason, tell me, have you ever been involved in translation in any way?
Well, actually, it's funny you should ask, but I have. And it's even funnier when I tell you what I've translated. A menu.
And then...
Yeah, I worked in a hotel for a few years, and they opened a restaurant within this hotel always while I was in Italy. And the owner of this hotel/restaurant was a terrible guy and just didn't want to spend any money to do anything. He didn't want to get anyone to translate these things professionally. So it was, well, Jason, you're English, you speak Italian, translate the menu. And I can assure you...
At least he used a native speaker of English.
That's true. But if anybody listened to our food episode, they know that I'd rather have a pill than eat. So my knowledge of these different menu items was not brilliant at all, and I was very reliant on the internet, and I'm sure it was a big mess. And I think I translated once a guidebook for a butterfly farm or something like that. It's like one page of text that they'd opened this little thing, and a friend had agreed to do it and couldn't, and so he pulled me in last minute. But I'm terrible at translations, I think, probably because I don't know either of the languages that well. That's how I feel about the
matter. I'm a serial language learner. I love languages. Now, you've lived abroad, I haven't. What's your experience of learning a language while living abroad?
So, you mentioned having kind of a deep knowledge on I don't know if deep knowledge is the right subject, but you sort of said you have to become an expert in so many different things because your translations deal with a number of different things.
It tends to be a shallow knowledge or kind of broad field,
That's right, not a deep knowledge. Right. And I think it's kind of the opposite, because living in a country, you'll get very good at certain things. Like, so for me as well, the way I learned was through conversation, which is kind of what pushed me towards this podcast as well. Is that I think I don't care how good you are with a book, if you can't speak, what's the point? So that's my viewpoint. Don't quote me on that, but it's been recorded. So I would, I'm happy to engage someone in conversation, and you talk about similar things, so you get very good on certain topics. Sometimes you mistakenly think you are good at that language. I know how to speak this language very well, and then you go to the doctor and you realize you have no idea how to. At times you realize I have no idea how to express this in my language, let alone in another language. And I think I found that to be the case, that you'd be, depending on the people you spent time with or the kind of job you were doing or what you're doing, you'd get very good at speaking about certain subjects,
but you find holes.
Massive holes. Huge gaping chasms of knowledge.
Suddenly you're going through a perfectly normal day and you find yourself in an unexpected place where you just don't know how to say what you need to say.
Exactly. And I think it can be overwhelming. Again, it depends. So I moved away on my own, and which meant I wasn't with a family member or a friend who we could just relax and slip back into English. If it was English, it was with people who were learning English, or it was in Italian, and it means you can't sort of step away for 2 minutes, say, well, look, I've gone as far as I can go, pause, I'm going to walk away and redo it. You are constantly bombarded by this thing, and
that's mentally tiring.
Well, actually, if you're physically tired, again, going back to the doctor, you go to the doctor, probably you're not feeling well. So you're already sort of in pain or not feeling well for whatever reason, and you're trying to work out how to say something in a foreign language. And technically the doctors, they're supposed to know English because a lot of the medical textbooks are in English. Spoilers, they don't know English. So it's really a struggle. I think that's what I found. And it's interesting because, again, when I was learning to speak Tagalog because of my wife, we didn't live in the Philippines, but again, surrounded by Filipinos and friends. And but that was, because I was doing that by choice, there was more focus on grammar and being able to write the language, to read language. And actually, even though I speak Italian a lot better than I speak Tagalog, probably grammatically my Tagalog is a little bit more on point than my Italian, just because that was the focus more when I was doing that. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully if you've made it to this point, you've found something interesting in this topic. As always, at the end of the show, we just like to let you know, if you would like to be on the podcast to speak about a topic of interest that you think is something that others would enjoy listening to, well, you can contact us on Twitter or Instagram at ACWpod, or you can email directly aconversationwithpod@gmail.com. So until we see you again next week, we'd just like to say goodbye.
Goodbye.